fast. I was just saying I have been called Hurricane Katrina before, which seemed to be quite apt for the speed. So we had a jellyfish come in on Twitter. There was a question put out there about the link between animals and maps. What does it remind you of? And we had the sloth and the turtle, and somebody said the jellyfish because of it changes constantly. What specifically changes constantly? The rules, the approach, the conversations?
So the comment was that it was a jellyfish because it takes different shapes depending on who's talking about it.
Ah, okay. Oh, and a sting in the tail. Yeah. Except that a jellyfish is fairly transparent, I would say. So that's the positive side of things. Okay, so welcome back. There's been some, no, people are broadly, I think, in the same place. No, the lady has moved again. You're there now. Very cunning. This lady who asked the question is still at the very back, though, but you have moved. It's very disconcerting. Okay, so welcome back. Welcome back to those of you who have stuck with us online or who are joining us online. Thank you very, very much. Phones on silent, please. Headsets to hand. All good? Okay. So this is kind of the second traditional graveyard shift for the body and the brain because you kind of just want to be horizontal and have a nap. But on the other hand, it's kind of the lightest because you know you're on the home stretch. And also, perhaps, we've come out of some of those areas where there's been a lot of emotions, which have been good, and a lot of, you know, very, very vocal. And we're coming into something, well, I say this, I don't know. We're looking at really some benefits. We're looking at, if we're talking about this from a socio-economic point of view, we're looking at some of those benefits. And we're looking at what are we looking at with really reasonable, proper, strategic fisheries management. Let's have a look at that. And also the short term, the long term, what can we expect there? Because as I said to you, timing is of the essence. So please do stay alive and alert because that is the respect we give to our last two speakers. So on the right, we have Fiona Nimmo, who is Director of Poseidon Aquatic Resource Management. And next to me, we have Griffin Carpenter, who is Senior Researcher, New Economics Foundation. Very gender balanced. They're going to have 10 minutes each. We can have a short chat before the Commissioner comes. Well, we're going to hear from Andrew first, actually, for some closing words, and then we're going to hear from Commissioner Vella. So what is nice about this session is it is a kind of a rounding off of today's entire narrative from the very, very opening remarks from Pew and what we heard from the EC through the three subsequent panels. We've taken stock of where things stand in terms of policy implementation. We've opened an awful lot of other doors, Pandora's boxes. We found some common ground. We found areas where there's common ground, but there's still quite tricky conversations to have when we're on that common ground. We had an interesting look at the regionalisation and the maps, and we had some very clear fears, opportunities, positive, negative on there. So now really we are looking at sort of the facts of the case studies, the stories of how improved management has brought benefits. As I understand it, am I correct? It's not just benefits for the ecosystem, but for jobs, communities, and for fishing businesses' bottom lines. We sort of have that whole holistic look there. What are the ultimate gains if we get management right across European waters? I think I'm going to start with you, please, Fiona, to deliver some top lines on the outcomes of some of the management work reports and other things. Okay. You staying in place there?
Yes.
Okay. So you've got tops 10 minutes, and thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. So I am Fiona Nimmo. I work for Poseidon Aquatic Resource Management, and I'm here today to give you a brief overview of some examples on what happens when management works, the benefits of ending overfishing. So Poseidon undertook this report for Pew in 2016. Our aim was to highlight examples where fisheries management achieved benefits in terms of economic, social, and environmental gains. We reviewed over 40 fish stocks in the Northeast Atlantic region and selected 5 case studies based on a set of criteria. So that included that the exploitation rate of the stock was consistently below or at FMSY. Overall, we covered a range of species, species types and stock distributions. These are the 5 case studies that we selected: herring, nephrops, horse mackerel, plaice and haddock. There are lots of examples to provide and lots of details within these case studies to discuss, but 3 that I'd like to mention today relate to herring, nephrops and horse mackerel. So on to herring. Herring are small, schooling, migratory pelagic fish with a low trophic level and are a very central component to the ecosystem. Consumption is very popular in Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, the UK, and in Belgium. We studied the North Sea, Eastern English Channel, Skagerrak and Kattegat stock, which has over 280,000 tonnes landed annually by over 8 different countries. Around 27% of the landings by weight are by Danish vessels, 26% by Dutch, and the remainder by UK, Swedish, and German. The graph on the top here, on the top left, shows the rate of fishing mortality, with the red line indicating FMSY. So we can see a very high fishing mortality in the. Do I have a pointer? Is it the? Hang on. Oh yes, I do. Oops. We have a very high rate of fishing mortality in the 1970s, which led to a stock collapse, which we can see here in the biomass graph, and subsequently a 4-year closure of the fishery. After the closure of the fishery, the stock recovered in the mid-1980s, and both fishing mortality and biomass began to stabilise to MSY. For this stock, a species-specific management plan for herring was introduced in 2008, and a long-term management strategy was adopted in 2014. So on to some of the benefits. This fishery is worth over 300 million euros annually in first sales value. That's based on a 10-year average figure. It supports pelagic fleets, which have become the most profitable segment in the European commercial fishing fleet, with herring accounting for 61% of the value landed by these fleets in this area. We found that the catch per unit effort has improved on average by 147%, and that this has created a higher catching efficiency, which means lower fuel consumption and translates into a higher income per full-time equivalent. From an environmental perspective, the healthy biomass ensures sufficient prey is available for other commercial species, commercial finfish, seabirds, and marine mammals. Other benefits noted related to the stock surveys being very inclusive and consultative in nature, particularly with the industry, and this led to greater confidence in the assessment conclusions and also implementation of the management tools. The next stock we consider is nephrops from the Skagerrak and Kattegat. Nephrops live in burrows within muddy, soft sediments, and they're caught by demersal otter trawlers. Consumption of this beautiful, sweet, succulent meat is very popular across Europe. This stock has, on average, 3,000 tonnes landed annually by 3 countries. 75% by weight is by Danish vessels, 24% by Swedish, and the remainder by German. So it's a very important stock for these 2 countries, Denmark and Sweden. An important factor when considering nephrops management is the distinct stock boundaries, which are shown in this top left graph here. There are 11 discrete functional units of nephrops shown here. However, a single TAC is set for all North Sea functional units, excluding Norwegian waters. So that's a single TAC for all of these areas. So it means there's a high potential for uneven exploitation. However, the Skagerrak and Kattegat is assessed as 1 stock by ICES, and a single TAC is set for this area, so the management is appropriate to the stock boundaries. The time series is not very long here on the graph on the bottom. It's from 2011, but we can see that in terms of sustainability of exploitation, the harvest rate is below FMSY. So on to the benefits of managing this stock. It's worth around 10.8 million euros annually in first sales value, and it's the most important resource in the Skagerrak and Kattegat for the demersal trawl fleet. The demersal trawl fleet in this area has a 62% dependency on this stock of nephrops. We found the catch per unit effort has improved, and average wages earned have increased for the Swedish fleets by 34% and the Danish fleet by 6%. Another benefit is high local consumption, with 90% of the Swedish landed nephrops consumed in Sweden, where the local market achieves 30% higher than average prices. Also, improved biomass of nephrops results in more burrows, which supports the increased creation of the Osper priority habitat of sea pen and burrowing megafauna. And the joint Nordic interdisciplinary approach to managing this stock has brought closer cooperation between management, scientists, and also the industry. Finally, having a look at horse mackerel. Horse mackerel in the Atlantic Iberian waters are caught by, pelagic and demersal trawl, and they're important to both the large-scale offshore fleets and also the small-scale inshore fleets. The fishery is worth 28 million euros annually, with 58% of landings by Spanish vessels and 42% by Portuguese. African countries and Portugal are the key markets for this stock, which primarily enters the human consumption market. The stock has been consistently above the MSYB trigger, with exploitation rate well below FMSY. For this stock, there's also been improved catch per unit effort across a 5-year period. It's improved by 93%, and that's contributed to improved economic performance, but in particular for the small-scale inshore Portuguese fleet. Horse mackerel have become increasingly important to the Portuguese canning industry, which saw a limit in terms of raw material supply when there was a 78% reduction in sardine landings. So the growth in horse mackerel supply has sustained the canneries in Portugal and the 5,000 jobs that they support. So, some conclusions and common themes of our report. The case studies that we examined showed that management actions have successfully ended overfishing. So reversing overfishing is possible and can be achieved for other stocks. Fishing stocks at or below MSY allows the stocks to remain robust, and it provides food for us and for species within the ecosystem. The improved CPUE reflects more efficient fishing, faster catching, less opportunity to impact seabed habitats or bycatch species, lower fuel consumption, lower atmospheric emissions, and reduced operating costs. This all contributes to the improved fleet profitability, higher incomes for fishers, and crucial support for dependent coastal communities. Other social benefits that we found during the case study analysis included improved reputation of the fishers, leading to better market access. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So you have brought in, a lot of key points there. You've looked at the environmental side of things, you've looked at the coastal communities, you've looked at the fact that there's been a lot of local consumption, actually, as well, in the case of, I think it was the second, the nephrops, and you've talked about lowering fuel consumption emissions, healthy biomass, so being sufficient prey, so lots of issues there and a higher income. So let's just park those for a minute. Let's hear, sir, from you, please, what you would like to say, and then I can take 2 or 3 questions from the floor before I ask Andrew to give me some closing words. Thank you.
Sure. Oops. Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I've really enjoyed the discussions so far today, and we've heard a lot of different perspectives. I'm going to try to add one more perspective, which is coming at the issue of overfishing from an economic point of view, and just to kind of set the framework where I feel economics is relevant to this conversation is, in one hand, the CFP and in particular the commitment to MSY is coming at the issue of overfishing through an economic lens. This is about production, maximizing the production or the amount of food, fish that comes from the ecosystem. So already we're not talking about this from an environmental point of view. It's not about conservation in itself. It is about maximum production. So economics is at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here. At the same time, the CFP is now the law. And so discussing economics is informative to how we go about this moving forwards. But at the same time, it is the law as well. And economics, unfortunately, though, I may think it doesn't trump the law. There will be graphs, but most of it will look something like this, which is the green here is the yield we get from fisheries. And along the bottom, you can see effort. Think about adding another vessel, going out to sea another day. As you continue to add more effort, you increase the amount of revenue coming from the fisheries. And so that's moving up on the y-axis. But eventually, you start adding more and more vessels, and you deplete the stock. So then you start going down on the other side. To add to this perspective, we need some costs as well. So the green is yield, revenues from the fisheries, the red is the costs. And there are some fixed costs, the vessels, and some variable costs, the amount of fuel that you use, paying for crew. And so what we can see is that if we didn't have regulation, we're at this point here, where it's the profit criterion that at some point it's too costly to go fishing anymore, and so the industry operates at this equilibrium, sometimes further if there's subsidies. What MSY is trying to do is scale that back and saying we want to go to the point where you can get the maximum sustainable yield. So what this means is that it's the highest possible point on that graph. So at this point, not only is yield higher, so the green is higher than the unregulated state, but also costs are lower, so that it's a lower point on that red line. What this means is that by pursuing maximum sustainable yield, we actually have higher profits, what we would call resource rent, than otherwise occurs in the industry. From an economic perspective, it's actually at this point. To get a little bit nerdy, the tangent for your cost function to the yield function. And so this is actually at an even lower level of effort than we're at right now. But I'm going to park that for a second and just talk about the benefits of maximum sustainable yield and the end to overfishing, getting to that highest point there on the graph. So of course, there's economic benefits from this, having higher yield from the fisheries with lower costs, because it means you have a higher catch per unit of effort. When fish stocks are larger, it means you can spend less time at sea to get the same amount of revenues. These gains from fishing at this point, they might manifest as profits, as wages, or time at sea as jobs. This really comes down to how you structure the industry. Who gets the fishing opportunities? What's the cost structure of those fleets? Really, this is a question of broad economic policy as well. Different countries and member states can structure this differently with taxes. We know there are gains. You can structure the industry in different ways to see where those occur. At this point, maximum sustainable yields or region, there's also more stability there. You don't have the boom and bust cycles. There's fluctuation, of course, it's an ecosystem, but in general, the yield from the fishery is more stable. You can have more secure supply chains. You can make investments. It's really important to have that stability. And also at that higher point with maximum sustainable yield, we have a greater fish supply. So processors, consumers are big fans of this. With higher quantity of fish, should be lower prices to consumers. And it also means we're at a point where, as of right now, the EU depends on fish from other countries. Our fish dependence day is in July. If we actually get to maximum sustainable yield, it pushes that day off the end of the calendar. So many fish stocks right now are producing less than half of the yield that could occur if we got them to the maximum sustainable yield. So we could get more production outside of fisheries, which actually, as an economist working on environmental issues, is really interesting, because normally we have this trade-off between environmental regulations and the industry and chemical manufacturing or plastic manufacturing. It's always the environment versus the economy. That's what I'm used to dealing with. But in fisheries, it's actually not like that at all. We can increase production while doing the right thing for the environment. So dealing with renewable resources is fantastic. There's also some non-economic benefits from MSY. Some of these are environmental benefits. So if we have increased catches per unit of effort, which was mentioned from some of the case studies, it means you have a lower footprint per unit of fish that you're catching. So for each ton of fish that you're getting, there's a lower amount of bycatch, lower impact on the habitat and fuel usage, because there's less effort that is required in the system. Also, we would expect to see improved size and age structure. This was mentioned in the morning with the anglers, that if you improve fish stocks, your 0.1% mortality, you can be more selective in which those fish are compared to where we are right now. Also, if we think about quota species, for example, in the UK, that having low quotas and overfishing demersal species has pushed fishers to other species. So sea bass is a good example of this. Now that's crashed, so people are moving on to whelks and wrasse and anywhere where there's not that quota. So if we can actually improve the levels of fishing opportunities that are available for species, you can actually have a system that's more in balance with the number of fishers. I also think there's a real positive thing here for industry perception, that the public is now conscious that there's a problem of overfishing. There was a delay in getting that message across. Now we're kind of on the opposite end, where We're trying to tell the public that stocks are recovering. We know how to manage fisheries better, and there's a delay in that message. But if we can get stocks to a sustainable level and say, hey, we've ended overfishing in Europe, that's a really important thing to get across. And I think we owe it to the industry to get that message out there and say, we've gone through this hard struggle, and we're now out the other side. Right, returning to the graph. There's a couple points that I would like to make on economics of overfishing that I don't think are being properly appreciated right now. And one is about having multiple societal objectives. So I mentioned MSY at the top here, which is really about maximizing food that comes from the system. And the CFP and policy making in general is an interesting thing where there's a feedback process. We in this room are shaping the legislation, and in turn the legislation shapes how we think about this issue. And we've all kind of come to live with the MSY framework as the overall objective. But I don't think that's actually the objective that many stakeholders have. And we don't have a process right now in December Council setting TACs that actually responds to these multiple objectives. So I mentioned the profit objective would be at a lower level of fishing effort. It was mentioned this morning, Australia uses this sort of framework. But if we think about other objectives for fisheries, having high prices, obviously recreational fishing, these are at lower and lower levels of effort. From a conservation point of view, you're not thinking, let's get as much food out of the system as possible. You're thinking about protecting the stocks. And so we've come to live with the ICES advice saying 10,000 tons of cod. It's not saying, please go fish 10,000 tons. It's saying this is the limit. You can go anywhere below that. We've just come to live with this system as we're reducing fishing pressure. So we always pick the maximum point as the optimal point, but it's not the optimal point if we think about our actual objectives. So that's kind of where on that green line do we want to be, where on the yield. There's also a question about the costs and whose costs, because that graph that we were looking at is about the fishing industry itself. So here's a report from the World Bank that came out this month looking at the cost of fishing and subsidies, including fuel subsidies. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a lot of red, and there's a lot of red in Europe, because this is looking at the public cost of fisheries, all the costs of management. And so that shifts this line up higher because there's additional costs that aren't being considered. And this is actually somewhat unique in fisheries. If you talk to people working in forestry or mining, they're actually quite surprised when they hear that there's no kind of resource rent being generated from the fishing industry to pay for data collection or other forms of management. I think this is a conversation whose time has come. It would have been crazy 10 years ago. We'll still get reactions now, but I think it's time to have that conversation. I'm over time, so I will just touch on this briefly, but I hope this comes up in the questions. And it's about socioeconomics and setting quota limits. And it's been identified as one of the shortfalls of the CFP, and we don't really see how economics is being used in decision-making. What we do see sometimes is that compared to last year, the TAC proposal is 100 tons lower. You multiply that by the price, and you see that there's a hit of 5,000 euros. That's not an economic analysis. That's just multiplying a price by quota. The answer you're always going to get is higher is better, lower is worse. That's not an economic analysis. We want to look at transition pathways out into the future and see which transition pathway delivers the highest economic benefits. Pushing it all back to 2020 is a very risky strategy because we don't know what storms lie ahead in 2020. What we do know is that right now, the fleet is operating in profits, fuel prices are low. This is actually the time you want to make that investment in fish stocks. If you think back to the financial crisis and we're saying, man, if only we had improved public finances years ago, we would be in a better situation. I'm worried that's what's going to happen in 2020. So just copy down the title. Here's a paper some of us worked on from the JRC on the different transition pathways and trying to look at what was written in 2016, getting to FMSY in 2016, an incremental approach, or doing it in 2020. The benefits are higher the faster you get there. It was mentioned before, the fleet's currently in profits. This is a very positive trend to see. Of course, if we dive into detail, some fleets are much higher than others. It was mentioned this morning, there's a bit of a divide with the small-scale fleet, large-scale fleet, Northern European countries and the Mediterranean. And also we can see that fuel prices are low. So just wrapping up, I think fisheries is a unique issue here in how the environment and the economy can work in the same direction, and we can see that there's large potential benefits, probably around 5 billion euros in the Northeast Atlantic. Where those benefits occur is a question about fisheries policy and broader economic policy, not just a conversation for this room. And I think two things that should be considered here are around the public costs of fisheries and also around these multiple societal objectives. I don't see these things entering the conversation, which I think needs to happen if we want a more holistic perspective on fisheries.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, very, very interesting, very clear, particularly this issue, but how you have framed it at the end, saying, you know, we need to look at these transition pathways. So it ain't the maths, it's actually the economics. And what you say is the economics points to the benefits are higher, the faster you get there. And interesting, I mean, it is interesting when you say, I have been around other issues where they say environment and economics go hand in hand, but I think there is a clarity in this, or at least the way you have set it out, there is a clarity in this particular sector where they go together. And then again, you raise the issue of the public. You know, the public has been behind, the public is in this conversation. You said there was a little bit of catch up, and now we need to do some more catch up if we were able to turn it around. And we also industry owes it to itself to say we've ended overfishing. So we had a look at some of that. We had a look at some benefits, not least, and it's something that hasn't come up at all today, but I think that what you also put your finger on is that stability can also enable investment, and investment is obviously critical in all of this arena, and reduce dependency on imports. So is there anything, we have a little bit of time, we have literally 5 or 6 minutes. I don't know if you are all just really at the end of your energy with a surfeit of sugar and a surfeit of for your heads, and you're here for the last bit. Does anybody have a comment, anything interesting, their own project, anything that they can bring to bear? Any questions? The gentleman here, because I haven't heard from you. Yes? I love the way you magic up that mic. That's all right. And just make sure you push the button and hold the mic close to you and tell us who you are.
Michael Adams, Ocean Assets Institute. So we work on the connection between finance and industry in the maritime sectors. And so I was wondering, probably for both of you, certainly for Griffin, if you've looked at the two different, there's short-term financing of the seafood industry in trade finance, and there's long-term financing where basically European fleets are generally quite old, the boats, and there's upgrades needed not only for the fishing sustainability issues, but also lower emissions requirements, as well as selective gear. There's a lot of capital, long-term capital investment, as well as short-term trade finance needing. And I'm wondering if you've looked at the economics, as you've laid out the broad economics here, into those kind of financing decisions, and where are some of the optimal financing decisions that are the perfect storm that Javier talked about earlier today is happening on the financing side as well.
Thank you. Did we have another hand here? Or no, we didn't have another hand. We had another gentleman over here. Yes? Oh, you need to press the button next to the mic. Did you do that inside the side arm? Yeah, the sticker. There's a sticker there, but somehow nobody sees the sticker.
I'm just pressing a button on the microphone itself. Like, that's all I listen to. What can I say? I'm an economist, so that's I don't listen too well. Murray Rudd, World Maritime University. We've had some talk about profitability of the fisheries, so it's sort of the assumption that a lot of these fisheries have come along. Do we actually have cost and earnings surveys that can demonstrate that? Is there evidence? It seems to me a lot of this is sort of anecdotal. We see some higher wages. We do see the investment, which implies profitability. But do we actually know what the profitability across different sectors is?
So we got those two questions, optimal financing decisions and having a look at the short-term and the long-term financing, and this issue of whether do we have evidence that goes beyond the anecdotal. Do we have a question specifically for other speaker? Did you? Yes? Thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Catherine Schemmer. I work for Pew. I have a question for Fiona, and I'm not an economist, so maybe it's a very stupid question, but in your presentation, you mentioned on the NEFROP example the increased earning, and I think I saw that there was quite a big difference between the Danish and the Swedish, whereby I think the Swedish was only 6%, and the Danish increased wages were 6%, and the Swedish 34 something. Could you explain the huge difference?
Let's start with that and let's see where we get. I did see your hand raised too. Should we start with that? Indeed, yes, I saw that and didn't think to go, yes, very good. Can you explain?
Very good question. So part of it's down to the local market that we'd mentioned, the local consumption in the Swedish market, which brings higher prices. And the other aspect is that when which partly touches on the other gentleman's question, when we're looking at the profitability, we're looking at the fleet as a whole. So we're not just focusing on the demersal trawlers that we're targeting nephrops, it's also the fleet as a whole. So there may not have been as much profitability for other targeted fisheries by the Danish demersal trawl sector in that area, Skagerrak and Kattegat.
Can I turn to you, please, Griffin? So whichever order you wish to respond.
Sure, maybe the opposite order. So the data, we do have lots of good data. So the report that I had up there, the annual economic report, name suggests, comes out every year, and it's the status of different fleet segments. So for a country, you might have 30 fleet segments defined as a length, a gear. So we might have 10 to 12 meter pots and traps in the UK, and it'll say their profit margins, their wages, etc. So what we can see from the graphs, the trend is maybe the most important, is that it's been going up year on year since 2008, where we have a consistent data set. So just to give a little bit of context, so profit margins, we're looking at about 18% for the EU as a whole. As I said, small scale, large scale split, Mediterranean, Northern Europe. But in other industries, retail is very small, about 2% profit margins. Energy, water, other utilities, probably 5%. So this is extremely profitable. And this is because we don't allow entry into the fishing sector. If, to get to the investment question, if you're thinking about entering a new business and you see 20% profit margins, you'd get a fishing vessel. But that's not the way we've set this up. And that's why some countries like Iceland and the US start to charge a tax on the fishing industry, because we've created these profits as a government, as society, but they're going to the individuals who hold the fishing rights rather than society as a whole. On short-term, long-term financing, it's an interesting question. It's one that used to come up a lot more maybe 5-7 years ago when we were looking at the transition pathways in the CFP, and this idea that there are going to be some hard years ahead if we can get fishers out of the industry for a couple of years and then back in later. It's not one I hear as often anymore, and maybe it's because we've made some good progress. The point I would raise on this is optimal financing decisions is there's an interesting side debate around decommissioning, which I would say is, again, an economic question and not an environmental one. If you have a quota limit of 1,000 tons, if that's respected, it doesn't matter if there's 10 vessels or 100 vessels or 1,000 vessels. Specifically, decommissioning was happening in order to make that transition easier, that if you had fewer fleets, they could all have a decent level of income and make it through this transition pathway. So that happened, decommissioning happened, but now we're at a point where we do see larger profits and incomes, and we're still not making some of those hard quota reductions that we need to see. So there's been an interesting role for finance here where we've used it in some cases, few cases, but in some cases, but it didn't really deliver what we were hoping it to, because it's still politics at the end of the day. And so even when fishers have had positive opportunities, there's still this pressure on council every year to have an improved outcome compared to the year before. So yeah, maybe a little bit of context to some problems that financing mechanisms run into.
Just if I may just ask a question, I think we've still got a moment. Just taking it in a just slightly different direction, because again, just to come back to when you cited that, it'd be good to be able to tell the public we've ended overfishing. So I think there's obviously been a lot. We talked about the public perception of things, the demand, the understanding. On the other hand, the public know a lot of things at the moment, particularly with the plastic strategy just come out, and a lot of talk about marine litter. So we've got a lot of issues around, we've got deep sea mining, we've got all kinds of things that are there. Is it a tricky climate for fishermen? You've got you know, you've got all of these different issues. We're looking at the sea, and yet we're also looking, on the other hand, we heard at the beginning that, you know, there's been some sacrifices. We've heard that sacrifice is necessary for progress, but there's people's livelihoods. How do we get around that? There are solutions, but there are difficulties. What's your feeling? And I'll turn to you first. Fiona, what's your feeling about public, you know, farming's talked about a lot, and, you know, is it in the same level? And where is the public in all of this, beyond just that I want some sustainable food and I want to keep fish in the sea?
I think it's a very good point, and I think a lot of progress has been made on that. You mentioned it about eating sustainable fish, and the Marine Stewardship Council certifying stocks and fisheries so that the public know that they are eating sustainable fish. And a lot of that comes down to the retailers and their decisions on their buying fish. But to answer the question, is it difficult for fishers? Of course it is. They're the one aspect that can be managed. So yes, there is areas that can be covered in terms of marine litter and plastics, but in terms of managing the stock, there's lots of natural variations, and it's down to fixing the fishing mortality is the one thing that can be controlled. So that is why it's so important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because we want to think that society broadly is interested in fisheries just as we are, and they'll make the right decisions if they had the information. What we tend to find is something like MSC certification, that the returns to that are actually quite small in terms of a price premium. We expect it to be there, but it's just not. And yet in surveys, you see that people, when asked outrightly, when they're not shopping, say, oh yeah, sustainable fish is important to me. So I think at the end of the day, we come back to management, and that we have to, you know, create laws and regulations that ensure that we end overfishing, and we can't just rely on an upswell of consumer interest and understanding about the complexities of different species and gear types and ICES areas and where it's coming from. So I don't think we're going to see something similar to plastics and mining, and we have to be good citizens and representatives.
Okay. Thank you very much. Commissioner, your timing is impeccable, because I'm just about to bring this to a close. You've slipped into a seat there. It's like being at the Belgian cinema. So before I invite you, I'm going to, just to sum up, before I invite Andrew, you're going to come in and hear some closing words from Pew, which will sort of recap on some very big and quite discussions that we have had today. This was the most gentle one that you've come in on. But interesting, just some of the key points. I think it's very interesting. You did say that there were some areas to look at, like public costs. You did say that the benefits are higher the faster you get there. You did talk about transition pathways. You did, you know, both of you were talking about the environmental benefits and the link between the environment and the economy going hand in hand very specifically in this sector. Yes, very big, very huge. We could have sat here for a lot longer. We did have, as you say, CFP is the law. So I think that is kind of we've come right to the end where we started at the very, very beginning. So I'd like you to please give a very warm round of applause to these two good people who've given this final presentation before I invite Andrew from Pew to come to the stage. Please give them a very warm round of applause. Thank you. Thank you both. And Andrew, can you take to the podium, please?
Right. Well, I will speak only briefly, because I do not want to delay our very important final speaker. We left those excellent presentations on the benefits of good fisheries management until the end of the day, because we wanted to finish on a positive note. But I think what struck me today is how much of the day has been positive. We dealt with some really difficult issues through the course of the day, looking at overfishing statistics, looking at the politics of regionalisation and making that work, and then, of course, the landing obligation, which is never easy to discuss. But what has struck me is the positivity about the progress made and the potential to make more progress and to deliver on the CFP's objectives. And I'm particularly grateful for our friends from the fishing industry who've contributed today. I've had some good conversations in the breaks, and their intervention has been particularly useful for us to hear. So I just wanted to say that, even though I'm grateful for all our speakers. Before I introduce the Commissioner, I want to just abuse my speaker's privilege to remind everyone of one piece of positivity from this morning, where we mentioned the progress made on setting fishing limits for 2018. So it seems that through the course of those very late night October and December councils that the Commission and the Commissioner in particular helped guide ministers to making better decisions on these fishing limits for 2018. So I'm particularly grateful to the Commissioner for that hard work, particularly impressed with his stamina and resolve working through the night to 6:30 a.m. in December to help hold ministers to their commitments. So I just want to repeat that important piece of positivity from today, among many others that we had. So it's a great honour for me, with that in mind, to introduce the Commissioner, Karmenu Vella.
I'll stay. Am I allowed to stay?
Of course.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Katrina. I'm sure that you covered a lot of ground on how and what the CFP is delivering. Thank you, Andrew, as well, for reminding me of those 3 December days and 2 nights, which took some years of my longevity, I have to say, but probably it was worth it. Let's say that. And I think that coming December, it might even be more difficult, because the closer we get to 2020, the less flexibility we will have. But again, thank you for inviting me to close this important conference today. And I would like to thank Pew, not just for their support throughout the year, but for all your work on ending overfishing. And I have read your recent report with very great interest, and I am grateful for your efforts, your wholehearted efforts to raise awareness on this topic. There is really only one main message that I want to pass on to you all today. And that message is that when it comes to sustainable fishing, the European Commission is your ally. Because ending overfishing is one of the key objectives of the European Union's common fisheries policy. The European Commission is and will remain fully and totally committed to this goal. And yes, some of us here today may have our differences on how we best move forward. But the objective itself is not up for discussion. In this, we are all on the same page, and we are all singing from the same hymn book. And I think this deserves repeated pointing out. I think it is also worth pointing out that the significant progress that we have made already through our efforts and through the objectives of the CFP. In the Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Baltic Sea, the rate of overexploitation has drastically declined, thanks to the more responsible catch limits we have set. In 2009, we were fishing a mere 5 stocks at MSY, that is, at sustainable levels. Today, less than a decade later, we are at 53 stocks out of 76, and the number is growing every year. Ending overfishing pays off for fish stocks. Northern hake has grown from 32,000 tons in 2006 up to 265,000 tons today, an increase of more than 700%. In 2007, North Sea sole stood at less than 18,000 tons. Now it's nearly 4 times as much. And these are not isolated cases, but they are part of a much bigger trend. Ending overfishing also pays off for fishermen. In 2015, the European Union fleets registered record high net profits of almost 800 million euros. And this represents more than 50% increase in a mere 2 years, making fisheries one of the European Union's strongest growing economic sectors. And we expect this positive trend to be confirmed for 2017 and 2018. Our analysis shows that this money has ended up in the pockets of fishermen who have seen their salaries go up. It has ended up in coastal communities where the quality of life has also increased. In short, the evidence that we have here is very, very clear. Ending overfishing makes environmental, makes social, and even economic sense. In fact, in light of this evidence, the question is not whether we can afford to act. The real question is how can we afford not to act? So we should continue in this direction. This also means continuing our work to implement the landing obligation, one of our most important tools to achieve sustainable fishing. Eliminating discards is difficult, but not impossible. Member states and fishermen themselves have done a lot over the past decade to fish more selectively. Projects like Discardless and Gearing Up have uncovered further potential. If we want sustainable fishing, we have to continue down this path. And I know that there are concerns about the control of the landing obligation at sea. Let me assure you that this is an issue that the European Commission, this is a very important issue that we are looking at very, very closely. At the same time, in some cases, choke situations might occur. This is very true, even when all the flexibilities of the common fisheries policy have been used. In such cases, we have a responsibility to work together with member states and to work together with stakeholders to explore pragmatic solutions based on solid scientific advice. Colleagues, ending overfishing is not just about sustainable catch limits and about the landing obligation. It also means pushing ahead with our multi-annual plans for individual sea basins. We have one for the Baltic, we have one for the North Sea, and their merits are very clear. They translate the common fisheries policy into action. They allow us to pursue our sustainable fishing objective while giving member states the flexibility to respond to different regional needs. I know there are different views on how to make the plans as effective as possible. As always, I welcome views on where we could improve. But let me be very clear. I firmly cannot accept any claims that with these plans we are somehow condoning overfishing. This is not just my personal view, it's what the scientists from ICES have told us, what they have told you repeatedly. One cannot cherry-pick the scientific advice. One cannot trust these scientists when they tell us about the state of the stocks, but then cast doubt on their credibility when it comes to multi-annual plans. And we have to be careful that this is a slippery slope. When it comes to science, there is scope for scientific debate, yes, but there is no room for any alternative facts and for discrediting science. This is something that I repeat over and over again. Either we're going to accept science and go by all the time, go by scientific advice, but once we start doubting and throwing doubts on that scientific advice, then there is no end to it, because that doubt will be used by NGOs, that doubt will be used by MEPs, that doubt will be used by the fisheries sector, and there is no end to it. Our multi-annual plan for the Adriatic is currently in the hands of the Council and the Parliament, and here we need to ensure a plan that can address the worrying situation of anchovy and sardines. It is fair to say that previous measures have not been effective, so we really need to step up the game in this area. And that is why, as you know, the European Commission suggested introducing catch limits. Experience from other sea basins show that catch limits work. In the Bay of Biscay, anchovy is the best example that we have. That said, I do realize that there is quite some resistance to this idea, and I am open to finding suitable and pragmatic solutions to the worries that have been expressed. But then again, let me be very clear. Any solution that we put on the table will need to be based on science. This also goes for the two outstanding multi-annual plans my services are currently drafting for demersal fisheries in the Western waters and in the Western Mediterranean. Which brings me to my last point today, the deeply, even deeply personal, worrying situation in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. It is no secret that overfishing in these sea basins is prevalent, and it is high time that we reverse the situation. But it is also clear that the European Union cannot do this alone. Both sea basins are shared with other non-EU countries. Without them, without these non-EU countries on board, there is only so much that we can do. And that is why the European Union has taken the lead to translate the political commitments of last year's high-level Medfish Forever declaration as well as the Bucharest Declaration into tangible action. Thanks to this push, at the end of last year, the GFCM, which as you know brings together the European Union and our international partners, the GFCM adopted an excellent package of measures. Many of these measures were actively supported by organizations here in the room today. And I would like to thank you for all your support. These measures, which I'm referring to, include a fishing restricted area in part of the Adriatic, the first ever multi-annual plan in the Black Sea, setting up a system of total allowable catches for turbot for all 6 riparian states, a pilot project for an international inspection scheme in the Black Sea, and permanent groups dealing with vulnerable marine ecosystems and fishing restricted areas within the GFCM. And we will continue to build on this work this year at the highest political level. For instance, at the GFCM High-Level Conference on Small-Scale Fisheries in September, at the Fisheries Forum in December, or for the Black Sea, at the High-Level Conference the European Union is organizing together with the Bulgarian Council Presidency and the GFCM in Sofia in June. But not only at the highest political level, but also at a more operational level, where we would like to use this year's GFCM annual session to tackle issues like the European eel, red coral, sharks, fishing restricted areas, as well as vulnerable marine ecosystems. Colleagues, as I said at the beginning, in the fight for, or in the fight against illegal fishing, in the fight for sustainable fishing, the European Commission is your partner and your ally. Implementing the CFP, implementing the common fisheries policy is challenging. It's challenging for fishermen as well as for member states. And this is not a design flaw. It is precisely because of the high level of ambition we have set. We will only succeed if we join our efforts. And I do hope that I can count, as always, on your support as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your final words. Interesting when you say solutions have to be based on science. You made a very strong point of that, so that science and the evidence doesn't get appropriated by all and sundry in all kinds of different ways. And again, you've kind of taken us full circle, because at the beginning we had lots of stuff. We were sort of at one point almost verging on death by statistic, and we were having a lot of talk around that. And then what was interesting and kind of echoed by your words, we did have an intervention from the Scottish fisheries sort of saying, well, the end of the day, you know, we can just sit together. There are solutions to be found. We've got to budge, all of us, you know, where are we going to get to? But the attitude has to be there in order to work with the legislation, which is the law. So we have to find the solutions. So, you know, you're echoing some of the things that have come up today. So thank you very much. I won't, you know, I do need to release you all, but I will say from, again, the laywoman, I should say the laywoman, I called myself a layman all day. From the laywoman point of view, from you know, having that first debate and thinking and sort of even saying, my goodness, you know, here's me, I'm a newspaper reader, you know, I'm not a specialist, and I hear this and all of these different standpoints, and it's, whew, it's tricky to see what to make of this and where we're going to find this common ground. I would say, I would agree with Andrew that actually there was a lot of good stuff there. There wasn't the intention from you to come out with consensus, but to see where this is overlap and to see where the agreement to make sacrifices going forward, which was one of the big words used earlier. There was talk on the need for political will to look at these, particularly some of these difficult issues around choke species when we looked at the landing obligations. We did have some conversation around transparency issues, whether it was in the maps and in general, and even in the decision-making process around this. And we looked at flexibility, important, but flexibility without parameters, we need to be careful with that too. And then the comment from our last speaker there, I think, I'm probably not going to phrase it exactly, but, you know, even you say economics doesn't triumph over law. So I think you said that right at the end. You know, we're looking at production, we're also looking at environment, but there is the law there, and that's what we need to find the solutions to within that parameter. I think that was echoed in general by industry today on the whole. So we did have some different viewpoints. So thank you very, very much. I just come back one more time, even if you haven't got your cards. We did a poll, Commissioner, twice at the outset and just at the end of the first panel. So who believes the EU can end, maybe you want to close your eyes at this point, who believes the EU can end overfishing by 2020? Do you still have your cards with you? Well, I know you're not all left in the room either. This is also true. Look, that is such a pick-me one. I love it. It's so high. Do the ayes have it? I haven't done the exact counting, but maybe the Greens just have it. OK, did anybody change their position from start to finish of this day? You did? Oh. Ah, you're cheeky. OK, so thank you very much. Just one more, also very unscientific. Do you leave today with a nugget or two of something new? I know you're all experts of different degrees. Would you say that it's been profitable for you to come here in the broadest possible sense? Great, because do you know what? The people who came to speak, I thought they were fantastic. When you get passion and erudition both at the same time, that makes for really good conversation. And to have that, and they respect the timing, I really humbly thank you all for that. I also very much, let me just say thank you to Pew for organising and hosting this event, in particular thanks to Andrew for your huge input there. To Vera for, I just said, by the way, that last comment that the person was talking about waste, I thought, don't make me go there because I actually don't understand what you've just said. But we didn't, so that was all right, the very last comment. Thank you to the technicians. Thank you very much to the interpreters. I think you are, I don't understand your brain wizardry, but it's fabulous. And aside, of course, from our speakers and panellists, thank you so much to all of you, not just for registering, but for actually turning up. As you know, it's less and less of a given these days, so I appreciate you just for that, because actually there's no discussion if you're not here. So your attention and your contributions were highly appreciated. I have really enjoyed being with you today, swimming around in these waters. I do hope, again, that you've got lots of stuff to chew on. I wish you a very fruitful onwards journey, and drink up now. There are drinks outside. Have more chat, and I wish you a very safe trip home. Perhaps see you again. Thank you very, very much. Will the slideshows be available, Andrew? Does it? Yes, the slideshows will be available. Thank you, sir. Excellent. All right. Fly be free.